Well, hello. This is chapter 4 of your textbook, and this chapter is packed with a lot of punch, and it's an increasingly the more you know about epithelial cells and tissues, well, actually tissues, not just epithelial, the more interesting it becomes. It's a chapter, let me just tell you in advance that some of the information seems like it's kind of pulled out of nowhere. It doesn't have a relationship to what you don't have a natural context to this material. I finally found the way I want to say it. Whereas when you study the muscles or the bones or even skin, you have a natural context because you have certain preconceived ideas about how your skin works, your bone, etc. Tissues, not so much. So again, it'll seem like maybe little bits of abstract information, but I have to tell you, it probably will be a chapter that you'll go refer back to as you try to understand the different systems that you have going forward. So let's get started on tissues, chapter 4. Again, some great pictures in your book and great artistic renditions of what we are talking about. Tissues are groups of cells. We talked about cells last chapter, and we will refer to many of those structures, particularly the cytoskeletal structures of the cell, the microfilaments, the thin filaments, the intermediate filaments, and how they relate to the outer portion of the cell, outer portion of the inside of the cell, and make the attachments of one cell to another, because that's what tissues are. Tissues are cells or collections of cells that get together to perform a specific function that an individual cell would not be able to do by itself. There are 4 types of tissue, and each of those 4 types have specific structures, and those specific structures give them the function that they have, whether that be secretion, absorption, contraction, irritability, which is what the word we term neural tissue with, whether they are all over the body and give the body its structure or its strength, which is what we think of with connective tissue. Those have a specific structure. Each of those tissues have a specific structure that allow them to perform their function. Tissues get together, multiple different types, to form organs. Organs are something that we start having a point of reference to. You kind of understand how your heart works. You kind of understand how your GI tract works in a layman's terms, and some of you who have had anatomy before in a little bit deeper way. But so tissues get together to form organs, and then, as I said, they're collections of cells. And that collection can be billions or millions, I guess, or it can be a small finite amount of cells to perform a function. 4 types, as I said, based on the definition that we just went through: epithelial tissue, which we'll talk about first, connective tissue, pervasive throughout the whole body. Almost every area where you have the other 3 type of tissue, you have connective tissue involved in it in some way. So you have connective tissue around or intermingled amongst the individual cells or individual tissues, or you have it attaching parts one to the other. Muscle tissue, those are your skeletal, your smooth, your cardiac muscles. Any place where where the body needs to move something, you're going to have a muscle there, with the exception of those microtubules or the filaments, which are actually made up of the contractile proteins, the same proteins that make up muscle tissue. Neural tissue, this is your nervous system. This is the ability to communicate via electrical impulses. That's what we mean about irritability. It has the ability to have a polarity, to shift in terms of ions. That ionic shift makes the electrical impulse that then sends a communicative message one cell to the next in terms of the nervous system, and then when that all acts together and is functioning in the brain to the spinal cord, in the brain spinal cord to all your nerves that you have in your body, we consider that the functioning nervous system, which you have several chapters about the nervous system coming forward. So those are the 4 types of tissues, and we'll talk a little bit about each one in this chapter. First one is epithelial tissues, and this is the main chapter. We talk about epithelial tissues. We do talk about epithelia and connective tissue in this particular chapter. Actually, we talk about connective tissue throughout many of the chapters because of its nature. You have individual chapters on the muscle and on the nervous system, so we'll just hit those 2 types of tissue pretty lightly in this particular unit, this particular chapter. Bone is actually connective tissue, and so is blood connective tissue. So that's what I mean about we'll hit it in this chapter, but you do have it coming forward in many other chapters. Epithelial cells are kind of the workhorses, I guess I would say that now, kind of the workhorses of the body. They cover all your surfaces. So you think of your skin as epithelial tissue. And so exposed surfaces, skin is the biggest exposed surface that you have. And then internal spaces, the epithelial tissue lines internal spaces. And although you may not know, I mean, you can probably address your GI tract, yes. You can address your blood vessels, yes. Specialized form of epithelial tissue. You can think of your, I guess, your respiratory tract. These are all areas where you have internal spaces that are going to be lined with epithelial cells. Epithelial cells have this capacity to secrete, so they are what forms glands. Secretion, think of glands as sweat glands, oil glands, your hormonal glands, so the glands that you have that secrete to the external surface of the skin, but also glands that secrete inside the body, like your the pancreatic duct that's going to secrete digestive enzymes is going to have a epithelial component to it. And in terms of functions of connective tissue, so that's the general idea of what connective or what epithelial tissue does. Is it is the tissue that lines the outside and inside, and think of all the things that are happening, and that is part of the function of epithelial tissue inside and outside the body, all the toxins, the digestion, the elimination of fluids to the surface, the sweat. I guess that's not really an elimination of fluid, but the providing fluid to the surface of the skin to control your temperature. These are all jobs of epithelial tissue, and part of their function is to provide protection. So physical protection, whether that's on the outside or whether that's inside the digestive tract, making sure that hydrochloric acid in your stomach doesn't actually digest the stomach. So provide physical protection, control the flow of something through the cells. So control the flow of permeability. Provide sensation. You have a nervous type tissue, not really a nerve, but nervous type tissue associated with epithelial cells that create part of your general senses. So that general sensation, that sensation that a mosquito is walking on you, even though that mosquito doesn't weigh anything, that general sensation of heat, cold, etc. And then special secretions, as we talked about already a little bit. In terms of specialized cells, the ability to move fluids, so over the epithelial cells, so out of the epithelial cells or through, so the fluid can actually be moved through the epithelial cell, And also permeability, particularly we think of proteins. We want to make sure that certain proteins are held within the cell or within the interstitial space. So you have this permeability, proteins, ions, glucose, those things that are needed by the cell, and also those things that want to be expelled by the body. So when we think of perspiration, a lot of times I get this a lot from students who tell me they want to perspire to get rid of toxins. And yeah, some toxins get out that way. It's not necessarily the best way to get out of toxins, but yeah, you get when you perspire, you do get a lot of things out of your body that you didn't particularly want. So you can think of that permeability, and then the secretions for protection and messengers. Certainly, messengers. You can think of hormones. That's the bigger picture with regard to messengers, but also messengers that talk from cell to cell and area to area. So hormones are global, they're all over the body, but also the communication among cells, from cell to cell or to cell in a cell area, and then secretions in terms of protection with regard to irritants or toxins, and this can be of that tissue itself, or it can be of the body as a whole. Now understand, the epithelial cells are doing this. They are doing this with a command from the nervous system for the most part. Some of these things happen locally, just among the cells, but most of these things happen. The information is taken up via the epithelial cells to the nervous system, and the nervous system is controlling the response of the epithelial cells. But it's the epithelial cells in their function that have the ability to do all of this. And then we have an artist rendition of two generic epithelial cells and certain characteristics that they have. They have this ability to have polarity, and that's kind of a misnomer. When they talk about polarity, they talk about apical and basilar surfaces. So polarity in the fact that yes, you have one surface and another. So I guess that polarity is probably the best way to think of it, but don't necessarily think of it as positive and negative charge. So one surface and another. So you have the surface that basically opens into the either the environment or the lumen of the GI tract. So opens into an environment, whether that be the outside world or the GI tract. And then you have the surface that is not open into the environment, and we call that the basolateral surface. It's either attached to other tissue in the body in some way or attached to another epithelial cell. So basolateral, basement, bottom, and lateral aspects of these epithelial cells. On the apical surface, you have microvilli and cilia. Microvilli, definitely, generally we see this where we want surface area increased, like the GI tract. And cilia, we see this in areas where you have, cilia is a little bit longer than microvilli, in areas where you want a coordinated movement. And those cilia attach to the filaments right inside the cell membrane, that cytoskeletal filaments inside the cell membrane. And that cytoskeletal filament allows that cilia to beat in a unified pattern. And we think of that beating going on, say, in the respiratory tract and also in the reproductive tract, to actually move something along. If it's the respiratory tract, we're moving particles out, and if it's the reproductive tract, we're trying to move the female egg along. And we will pick this up in the next one.